Croeso I Abertawe. Welcome to Swansea, Wales's second largest city. Situated on the country's south coast, just under 40 miles from the capital Cardiff, Swansea is home to a wealth of captivating history and impressive sights. And on this walk around the city centre, we'll explore everything from Swansea's Viking origins to its mighty medieval past. We'll stroll alongside historic docks as we delve into the city's proud maritime history. We'll visit the oldest museum and the tallest building in Wales. And we'll get to grips with the story of local literary legend Dylan Thomas, perhaps the city's most famous son, and the places where he once walked. All of that is to come over the next 40 minutes as we explore Swansea in depth on a gorgeous sunny afternoon. But we begin our walk in the very heart of the modern city, on a wide open plaza known as Castle Square. Now, it's no mystery as to where the square gets its name from, because just across the road there stand the ruins of the city's oldest building of all, Swansea Castle. The castle can trace its origins back more than 900 years. It was first founded all the way back in the year 1106 by the Normans, as they sought to cement their control over the south and west of Wales. But that original castle was actually built of timber. The ruined stone fortress, which stands in the heart of the city today, is a little younger, built over multiple decades in the mid-13th century, just under 800 years ago. But whether in stone or timber, Swansea Castle was an unmistakable symbol of Norman power in this region, and as such it was a major target for native Welsh rebels fighting Norman rule. The castle was subjected to numerous sieges over the centuries, although that isn't the reason for its ruined state in the 21st century. Though now dwarfed by modern office blocks and more, Swansea Castle was once much larger than it is today. But it became neglected by successive landlords for centuries, and its once great halls and towers were taken over by locals to be used as everything from workhouses to bottling factories. Much of the castle's historic interior was then demolished in the early 20th century, making way for a newspaper office where none other than a young Dylan Thomas worked as a reporter for the South Wales Daily Post. But those offices didn't last long. They were removed in the 1970s, and in the 2010s what remains of the castle was restored, allowing us to admire it from up close in the present day. Now, directly across the road from the ruins is of course Castle Square, the city's central public space which was indeed once upon a time located within the castle's walls. Today though, it's home to a couple of water features, as well as the distinctive yellow leaf boat sculpture here, a fetching piece of public art inspired by the poetry of Dylan Thomas himself. The leaf boat is an instantly recognisable feature of the open space at the very heart of Swansea. But the fact is that this part of the city looks vastly different today, not just to how it did centuries ago when the castle stood in better shape, but also to just under 100 years ago. Before the Second World War, Castle Square was the site of a huge old department store. The shop was called Ben Evans, and it sold some of the highest quality merchandise for miles around. So good in fact that it was long known as the Harrods of Wales. But Swansea's prestigious department store wasn't to last. It was sadly destroyed by the bombs of the Luftwaffe during a devastating air raid campaign in February of 1941, when thousands of bombs were dropped on the city in the space of just 3 nights, destroying Ben Evans and multiple blocks of central Swansea. Even worse, more than 230 locals were killed, and a further 400 were injured during the 3-night blitz. And so in their memory, the site of Ben Evans was redeveloped as a grassy memorial garden, known as Castle Gardens, which existed until it was paved over in the 1990s, creating the modern Castle Square. The intense 3-night blitz laid waste to much of the city centre, which was lit up in flames as fire spread widely on those catastrophic February evenings. Behind the trees in front of us, for instance, stands St Mary's Church, which was rebuilt in the 1950s, after it too was heavily damaged during the war. But just across the road here, there stands a building which fortunately escaped destruction during the Blitz. The Cross Keys Inn, which is the oldest pub in Swansea. Alongside the castle ruins, it's one of two medieval buildings to be found in the city centre, and it was originally built all the way back in the 14th century as the Hospital of the Blessed David, an almshouse which was designed to provide treatment for the medieval city's poor and sick. Now the pub, much restored in the 700 years since its construction, is a valuable reminder of Swansea's lengthy history, a coastal settlement which has been highly prized by successive civilisations, with native Britons, Vikings and Normans all having played a part in the early chapters of Swansea's story. Indeed, despite having been rebuilt less than 70 years ago, St Mary's Church is another storied corner of the city centre. Long before the building that we see today, a much smaller place of worship was built in the growing Norman settlement, possibly as early as the 12th century. The church was the dominant presence in this part of Swansea, just outside the castle walls, and over the centuries the building continued to gradually grow in size, expanded and reformed as different waves of religious fervour made their way towards this part of Wales. But for much of history, Swansea was a town home to just over 1,000 people, nowhere near the roughly 250,000 who live in the modern city today. And as such, St Mary's Church was never built to accommodate the vast numbers of people who would move to this city upon the arrival of the Industrial Revolution. The birth of heavy industry saw Swansea's population grow more than 100 times in size over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, and as such the old Church of St Mary had no chance of coping. To meet the demand of the city's now vast population, the medieval church was first renovated and then completely rebuilt in the 1890s, into roughly the shape that we see today, which of course was the work of a post-Second World War rebuild to revive the city centre's main place of worship. But what exactly was it that brought so many people into Swansea during the Industrial Revolution? Well, while the city saw a wide array of industrial activity during its boom period, its main business was copper smelting. By many measures, Swansea was the world's leading centre of copper smelting, so much so that it was even nicknamed Copperopolis, and development was spearheaded by a number of leading local industrialists, including the man depicted in this statue, Henry Hussey Vivian. Born in Swansea in the early 19th century, Vivian was part of a long line of wealthy copper industrialists, and later in his life he went on to serve as MP for Swansea in the House of Commons, where he pushed for greater development to the local port and harbour facilities, and championed locally mined coal on a national stage. Thanks to Vivian and many others, Swansea's fortunes as one of Wales' leading industrial centres continued to rise, fighting off the unstoppable rise of Cardiff and the valleys further to the east. Decades later, Swansea's industrial significance was the main reason it was targeted by the Luftwaffe in the three-night Blitz. But the bombs dealt a death blow to local industry, as Swansea's traditional industries fell into a terminal decline. Much of modern industry, in business parks and at the port, now takes place far away from the city centre. But the heart of Swansea is still regenerating itself in plenty of places. Just here, for example, is a small green, home to a couple of unusual pieces of concept architecture, intended as a taster of what people can expect when redevelopment in this part of the city gets underway. While there are plenty of points of interest already to be found in the city centre, modern development is intended to bring brand new highlights to the heart of Swansea, hopefully attracting ever more people to come and visit, or simply do business here. Just here a billboard shows us a number of the city's newest landmarks, with a beautiful new footbridge connecting the city centre to the delightful Marina, which we'll be visiting later, and a huge new arena and conference centre covered with more than 90,000 LEDs, the largest digital screen in the whole of the UK. There's plenty to look forward to, but let's return our attention to Swansea as it is today, because as we pass by St Mary's Church once again, we're about to make our way into a part of the city famed for its huge indoor marketplace, the largest indoor market in all of Wales. Now, Swansea's market has an illustrious history. It began more than 900 years ago when the Normans first settled here. And in the medieval era, Swansea was famed as a splendid market town, selling goods to people from all over Gower. Originally, the market existed out on the streets, centred around a historic market cross which stood roughly on the roundabout at the junction of Caer Street and Princess Way, just between Castle Square and St Mary's Church. But over time, the market grew ever larger, spreading across multiple streets. And so in the 17th century it was decided that the market should instead be brought under one roof. A brand new market hall, which was built on modern-day Castle Square in 1652. However, as we can see here, the market hall now stands a short distance away, and in a much, much larger form. And all of the ups and downs of Swansea's history in the past few centuries are part of the reason why. The 17th century market hall on Castle Square was a great success for its time, but inevitably the onset of the Industrial Revolution soon after meant that it quickly became too small to cope with the needs of the modern city. To rectify this, and to symbolise Swansea's ever-rising fortunes, a brand new market hall was constructed in the 1830s, right here on Oxford Street. It was huge and topped with a grand clock tower. But as the population kept growing, even it had to be replaced by an elegant new Victorian market of the 1890s, home to the largest glass roof in Britain at the time. It was a thing of beauty, and it would almost certainly still be standing had it not been destroyed during the Blitz in 1941. But Swansea without a market hall just wouldn't make sense, and so after the war it was rebuilt. The modern market hall, the largest indoor market in Britain, opened its doors in 1961, and it today plays host to a wide array of traders selling all kinds of goods, from fresh produce to artisanal crafts and plenty more. It's the main landmark on Oxford Street here, which is Swansea's main shopping street, stretching for nearly a mile across the heart of the city. Of course, we won't quite have time to make our way all the way along Oxford Street, so we're now going to make our way back towards Castle Square, before we then begin walking down towards the beautiful Marina, where we'll see a completely different side to this city. In the modern day, Swansea is indeed a city of many different faces. We know that much of the city centre here looks the way it does because it had to be largely rebuilt after the bombings of the Second World War. But if you walk just a few streets further inland from where we are now, you'll find yourself in a maze of hilly streets and neighbourhoods, where the majority of the city's 250,000-strong population lives. But of course, Swansea is also a coastal city, and as we now begin making our way towards the waterfront, there are plenty of beautiful seaside spots to enjoy if you're in town, whether that be the Marina, close to the city centre, or the enormous Swansea Beach, just a little further away. It's one of the longest beaches in Wales, stretching for 5 miles along the shore of Swansea Bay. But Swansea's coastal location is much more important than just providing some pretty scenery. For much of history, the sea was the way that Swansea traded with the outside world, having begun life more than 1,000 years ago when a small trading post was founded here by the Vikings. Situated on Wales's south coast, Swansea lay on a busy Viking trade route between Bristol and Dublin, the modern Irish capital, once one of the most important Viking settlements outside of Scandinavia. Along that route, Swansea was founded as a way station, a kind of stopping off point where Viking traders could take a break from the waves, and also take advantage of the plentiful raw materials to be found here in Wales itself. Now, much of this Viking trade took place centuries before Swansea Castle was established by the Normans here at Castle Square, and there are no remnants of the original Viking trading post to be found in the city today. That is, except for Swansea's name. Swansea may conjure up images of elegant white swans swimming in the seas off the coast, but the fact is that the city's English language name actually derives from the Vikings, and it would have been known to them as something like Swansea, literally meaning Swain's Island. Sweyn was none other than a king of Denmark, Sweyn Forkbeard, said to be the man who founded the trading post at Swansea in the first place. As for why he called it an island isn't exactly clear. It may have simply been to do with the settlement being bounded on one side by the sea and on the other by the mouth of a river, the River Tawe. We'll visit the mouth of the River Tawe at the end of our walk. But of course, while this city is known in English as Swansea, in Welsh its name is entirely different. The city is known as Abertawe, which has a much simpler origin. It means the mouth of the River Tawe. Once upon a time, the river flowed right behind Swansea Castle here, perhaps acting as a form of natural defence for the fortress, which we can see a bit more of from this angle, including the beautiful arcaded parapets, the arches at the top of this wall, which were added to the castle just under 700 years ago, around the year 1330. For all of the destruction that befell Swansea during the Second World War, it's remarkable that any of its medieval castle remains standing today. They certainly built them strong back in the Middle Ages. But there's one other street in the heart of the city which is home to a different ilk of pre-war buildings which survived the Blitz. Here we're passing by a former branch of the Midland Bank, originally built all the way back in 1908. And it's one of the many gorgeous buildings which stand on Wine Street here, home to perhaps the best collection of Victorian and Edwardian era buildings in Swansea's city centre. Remember that before the war, majestic and elegant buildings like the Market Hall and Ben Evans department store were fixtures in the heart of the booming industrial city. And so Wine Street is a good indicator of what the centre of Swansea looked like around 100 years ago. Now today the street is well known as the centre of Swansea's nightlife, with many clubs, pubs and bars housed inside historic banks and other commercial establishments. Just as its name suggests, the Bank Statement pub here was once another of Swansea's leading banks. Inside the restored bar, you'll still find the bank's old interior and even a few of the bank's original safes. But when it comes to distinctive bars on Wine Street, there are a few more intriguing than the Bank Statement's neighbour, the No Sign Bar. This unusually named bar is by far the oldest on Wine Street, founded more than 300 years ago in 1690. It was famously frequented by Dylan Thomas back in the day, but the No Sign Bar's most interesting feature is its name, which comes from an odd quirk of the law. Historically, all public houses, or pubs in Britain, were required by law to have a recognisable sign. But the No Sign Bar in Swansea was a simple bar, not a pub, and not a licensed establishment. As such, it initially had no sign, and it came to be known as the Bar with No Sign. Although eventually, when the bar got its licence to sell alcohol, it decided to keep the name, putting up the legally required sign, which reads, No Sign Bar. Now today, the No Sign Bar is one of a number of bars on Wine Street, which is packed with revellers on busy Friday and Saturday nights. But even before the rise of the street as the centre of Swansea's night scene, Wine Street was for centuries one of the busiest in the city. We know that this street was a centre of banking in the Victorian and Edwardian eras, but long before then, in the medieval era, it stood just on the edge of the castle walls, and was busy with people trading at the market, which spread all the way along this street from the market cross at the corner of modern-day Castle Square. Some people even say that this street's name comes from wine merchants who once traded here. The street, which follows the old course of the River Tawe before it was rerouted by the Victorians, was also an important link from the heart of medieval Swansea with the port at the river mouth, where many locals worked in shipbuilding or loading coal onto boats destined for ports elsewhere around the region. Now here, as we reach the bottom of Wine Street, this is the part of Swansea where we'll find plenty of examples of its proud maritime heritage, with a large complex of historic dockside buildings surrounding the beautiful modern marina. The marina is located just a short distance from here on the other side of this large road, Victoria Road, a busy tree-lined boulevard which winds its way around the city centre and along the coast, past Swansea Beach and towards the delightful Mumbles on the other side of the bay. Now, before it was redeveloped in recent years, Victoria Road here was once lined with houses, many of which were home to dock workers, as well as a number of industrial facilities associated with the port. Meanwhile, just a bit further along the road was the site of an old railway station, Swansea Victoria Railway Station, originally built in the 19th century by the Llanelli Railway and Dock Company, linking the thriving docks here with the towns of Llanelli and Carmarthen further to the northwest. The railway station was eventually closed down in 1964, and Victoria Road was largely cleared of houses and buildings in the same decade, giving rise to the major road that we know today. As such, this part of Swansea is a little more open than it once was, and looks rather different to the busy streets of the city centre around the castle and St Mary's Church. Having crossed over Victoria Road, we find ourselves on Somerset Place, lined by a colourful row of old Georgian townhouses here, roughly 200 years old. But just beside them here is one of Swansea's grandest landmarks of all, the majestic old Harbour offices. Built in 1903, this impressive Edwardian building was the home of the Swansea Harbour Trust, the body responsible for the administration of the city's harbour, which as we know was a crucial arm of its development through the centuries. For just under 90 years this building was the most important in the harbour, but in 1991 it was decommissioned and later transformed into a prestigious hotel, which it hosts today. Now, the fact that the Harbour Trust moved out of this building in the 90s didn't mean that Swansea's harbour came to a halt. Far from it, in fact. Centuries ago, Swansea's port was concentrated on the River Tawe itself, with an endless line of quays and wharves built along the river's banks, stretching up towards the castle. It was on these that goods were loaded and unloaded, and as trade grew, the riverside development became ever larger, with warehouses and more lining the riverbank, roughly along the path of the modern-day street known as the Strand. But this was before Swansea's meteoric rise as an exporter of copper, coal and everything in between. Once the Industrial Revolution kicked into gear, the river became ever more crowded with trade, prompting the city to modernise its harbour, developing this part of Swansea as part of the brand new Swansea Docks, which opened in the second half of the 19th century. Nowadays, the docks on this side of the river are no longer a centre of maritime trade, instead converted into delightful marinas. But on the other side of the Tawe, you will find the much larger docks at Port Tennant, still in operation as a major port, and the place where the Harbour Trust moved to in the 1990s. This area, though, has been redeveloped as a hub of culture and heritage, and there are few places where you can get closer to Swansea's proud heritage than here, at Swansea Museum. It was opened all the way back in 1841, which remarkably makes it the oldest museum in all of Wales, and it's home to a wide collection of exhibitions detailing the city's history. That includes fascinating natural landmarks like this, which isn't a stone post, but rather a fossilised tree which is millions of years old, found at the beautiful Henryd Falls, South Wales's tallest waterfall, in the Brecon Beacons, just to the northeast of here. Inside the museum, meanwhile, you'll find artefacts dating from the medieval era to the present day. But if there's one highlight of Swansea Museum above all else, it's without doubt the Egyptian mummy. It was purchased by a Swansea-born commander of the British Army in Egypt in the 1880s, and brought back to Wales here to be displayed in this city, an unusual but irresistible attraction of the country's oldest museum. And after visiting the City Museum, provided the weather's as good as it is today, take a moment to relax on the delightful lawn of Museum Green here, a pleasant open space which also hosts a number of city festivals throughout the year, from the Food Festival to Winter Wonderland during the colder months. And these unusual benches, when looked at from above, spell out the phrase pobl plus machines, the word pobl being Welsh for people. It's a reference to Swansea's significant industrial heritage, and while there are plenty of industrial and maritime exhibitions to be found inside the historic City Museum, just here on the other side of Museum Green is the much larger National Waterfront Museum, which serves as a national centre for the history of the Industrial Revolution in Wales. This huge museum, opened in 2005, grew out of a smaller dockside warehouse, which originally played host to the much smaller Swansea Industrial and Maritime Museum. Today the Waterfront Museum, which is free to visit, is full of highlights, not just samples of coal and copper from yesteryear, but pioneering planes, steam engines and more, which helped Wales on its path to industrial-era prosperity. The museum is an excellent centrepiece for this regenerated maritime quarter of the city. Just next door, there also stands the very distinctive LC Swansea, the city's huge leisure centre, which is built on the site of the old Victoria railway station. The LC has long been a tourist attraction in its own right. It was originally opened back in 1977 and played host to the very first wave machine in a Welsh leisure centre, a hugely popular water park feature which used to attract as many as 800,000 people every year. The building which stands today is the second leisure centre on the site, sometimes called LC2, and it was opened in 2008, with yet more cool features, including huge water slides and a surfing simulator. The weather in Swansea isn't always as spectacular as it is today, but the leisure centre provides a popular wet weather destination in the city centre, alongside the museums, which you'll find here by the waterfront. As we mentioned, the Waterfront Museum began life inside a dockside warehouse, that being the brick building we find here. It dates from 1901, built close to the peak of Swansea's industrial boom period, when the modern maritime quarter would have been brimming with activity. Today things are rather calmer, and after the post-war decline left this part of the city rather run down for a period, it's been beautifully regenerated as one of Swansea's most picturesque and most riveting districts. Its highlight is surely the refurbished docks, which are home to a wide array of boats to inspect as you walk along their perimeter. This, for example, is LV91, a historic lightship which now serves as a floating museum. But once upon a time, it patrolled the waters just off the coast of Swansea, shining its light as a kind of floating lighthouse to guide ships into port. This is one of a pair of boats permanently moored here as part of Swansea Museum. But surrounding them, you'll find a collection of much more modern boats, parked inside what is now known as Swansea Marina. There's space for more than 500 boats at the marina, everything from small pleasure craft to luxury yachts. But if we turn our attention to the other side of this busy waterborne parking lot, there's another surprising landmark of national significance. The tall building on the right is Meridian Quay, which may not look like much at first, but it's the tallest building in Wales. At present, it's also the country's only skyscraper, measuring 107 metres in height, although that title likely isn't going to last forever, because a new 113-metre building has been given the go-ahead to be built on Wood Street in Cardiff, Swansea's rival wrestling the honour away for itself. But for now, Swansea's Meridian Quay is the tallest building in Wales, and it's an important symbol of how this part of the city has been regenerated from that period of post-war industrial decline. We know that Swansea docks were built on a huge scale in the industrial era, as Copperopolis came to export as much as 60% of the world's copper. But when that trade, and the rest, began to dry up, there was no immediate use for the huge basins which had been built decades before. This area, close to the seafront, was developed in the 1850s as the South Dock. Just here we can see some of the old dock walls from that era. After trade had originally evolved on the River Tawe, the Victorians rerouted the river and used its former path as the North Dock, now filled in and known as the Strand. That was the first modern dock built in the city, and it was followed shortly after by the South Dock here, much larger than its predecessor and an important venue for maritime trade. But as even bigger docks were opened on the other side of the river, the South Dock here fell into decline, eventually closed down in 1971. But shortly afterwards it was redeveloped and reopened as Swansea Marina in the 1980s. Today the marina plays host to both historic vessels, like the old steam tugboat Canning here, as well as a vast array of luxury yachts and other pleasure craft. And it's a lovely part of the modern city, its success having helped to spur the wider development of the formerly industrial maritime quarter, with new houses built surrounding the marina, as we can see across the water, while a number of new cultural institutions were built too, as this part of the city became a centre of local heritage. Now, as we know from having walked the city's streets for the last half hour, Swansea is a city filled to the brim with heritage, whether that be the remnants of its medieval past in the form of the castle ruins, or the legacy of the Swansea Blitz, or indeed the city's proud industrial and maritime heritage, best experienced in the museums and historic dockside landmarks of the maritime quarter here. But there's another important piece of Swansea's legacy that we've only mentioned briefly so far: its rich literary heritage, as the hometown of one of the 20th century's most famous poets, Dylan Thomas. Over the course of a roller coaster career, Thomas wrote hundreds of poems and a number of books too. He's probably best known by the wider public today for the work "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night," "Old age should burn and rave at close of day," "Rage, rage against the dying of the light." Famously, Thomas's career led him to New York City in his later years, but his story began here in Swansea, the city where he was born, back in 1914. As his hometown, it's here in Swansea that we find a statue of Thomas, unveiled back in 1984, depicting the poet as a young boy gazing towards the sea, which lies just on the other side of the marina from here. Fittingly, the statue stands at the heart of Dylan Thomas Square, which blends the poet's legacy with yet more maritime heritage. The large brick pump house here, built back in 1900, standing tall over the square, and a channel linking the historic South Dock and the River Tawe. Now, Dylan Thomas was originally born in a neighbourhood of Swansea known as Uplands, to the west of the modern city centre. His house on Cumdonkin Drive is actually marked with a blue plaque, if you're looking for his birthplace. It's one of a number of Dylan Thomas landmarks to be found all over this city, a number of which are concentrated here around the docks, an area of Swansea which the former poet regularly passed through. Just on the other side of the square which bears his name is a theatre which also bears his name. The Dylan Thomas Theatre is the home of the Swansea Little Theatre Company, an acting troupe which Dylan, alongside his sister Nancy, was once part of in the 1930s, although back then the theatre was based in Mumbles further along the coast. During his brief period with the theatre company, Thomas distinguished himself with a number of acclaimed performances, although unfortunately he was thrown out after a couple of years for his overindulgent and often explosive behaviour. Across the street from the modern theatre, meanwhile, there stands a rather quaint little building, the old St Nicholas's Seamen's Church, used by local sailors as a place of worship between 1868 and 1919, although today it's home to a gallery and workshop, the church congregation having moved across the river to another place of worship by the Prince of Wales Dock. Now, the Seamen's Church is the first of a number of fetching landmarks on Gloucester Place, one of the oldest streets in the Maritime Quarter, having largely survived the Blitz and retaining many of its pre-war addresses. Harking back to the early 19th century, this row of houses, with distinctive Georgian-era facades, are some of the best in the city. In more recent years, meanwhile, eagle-eyed viewers may have even seen this street as a filming location in episodes of Doctor Who. But above all, it's another street which was regularly trodden by Dylan Thomas during his younger years. The poet spent his whole childhood in Swansea, although regularly travelled to other parts of South and West Wales on family holidays. And after leaving school at the age of 16, he took up a job as a reporter at the South Wales Daily Post, the newspaper which constructed its headquarters on the site of Swansea Castle. He worked for the Post for just 18 months, but continued working as a freelance journalist afterwards, and it was during this period that he covered almost every square inch of Swansea, spending plenty of time in the city's wide array of bars, not only the No Sign Bar back on Wine Street, but other establishments like the Queen's Hotel just here, which was opened all the way back in 1892. It was also during his time as a journalist that Thomas's collection of personal writings began to swell dramatically in size. He'd been writing poetry since his school years, but as he encountered new experiences on the city's streets, he was inspired to write even more. And many of the poems that he later went on to publish were written during this period. Here we find ourselves back at Swansea Museum, with a couple of industrial-era machines on display in the garden. Now, the museum was well loved by Dylan Thomas. In fact, he described Swansea Museum as the museum which should have been in a museum, and he'd often spend time here to wind down from his exploits in Swansea's bars and on its streets. These years were full of variety for the young writer, journalism combined with poetry, and of course his acclaimed but short-lived tenure with the Little Theatre Company. Now here we're passing by the historic Exchange buildings and the Post House, formerly the site of the headquarters of the South Wales Daily Post, after Dylan Thomas had left the newspaper. After all, his sights had become firmly set on literary success, and so he eventually decided to move to London in 1934, but he certainly didn't leave Swansea behind. Now we'll talk more about the city's most famous son in a few minutes' time, when we pass by the Dylan Thomas Centre just beside the River Tawe. But before we get there, we find ourselves once again strolling along Adelaide Street, home to the grand old Swansea Harbour offices, now the home of Morgan's Hotel. Happily, this gorgeous building is just as exquisite on the inside. The modern luxury hotel has retained many of the elegant features from when it was originally built, making it a wonderful place to stay if you're visiting Swansea. But just across the road is the historic Schooner Inn, another of Swansea's pubs housed inside a colourful row of Georgian-era houses, on the relatively quiet street known as Somerset Place. Once again, this street wasn't that calm back in the city's industrial heyday. Not only is it located right on the doorstep of the docks and the river, but it was also the home of a number of important civic landmarks. Swansea's old police headquarters were once located on this street, sensibly close to the centre of local government, which was the old Guildhall, once upon a time housed in the huge building that stands just at the end of Somerset Place in front of us. Now, back in the medieval era, Swansea's town hall was located close to the castle, but as the significance of the docks grew during the industrial period, focus shifted to this part of town, and so a brand new Guildhall was built here in 1829. Although enlarged and decorated even more in later years, that is the building we're looking at now, and it served as the local Guildhall for the best part of a century. But like so many places in ever-growing industrial Swansea, even this Guildhall became too small for local needs, so a huge new Guildhall was built on the edge of the town centre in 1934, that being the one which is still in use today. As the local government vacated this grand old building though, it went on to serve a number of different purposes throughout the 20th century, but in 1995 it was eventually refurbished and christened Tawe, the House of Literature. It was later renamed as the Dylan Thomas Centre as we know it today, celebrating Swansea's most famous literary figure. As we mentioned, Thomas moved to London in 1934, but he regularly returned to his hometown here, especially after moving with his wife to the village of Larne in Carmarthenshire. Thomas always had plenty to say about Swansea. He described it variously as a beautiful, drab town, an ugly, lovely town, Little Dublin, and a city of laughter. But eventually he visited his hometown for the very last time, as he began travelling regularly across the pond to New York City, where he performed readings of his ever more popular poetry. Sadly, it was in New York that his story came to an end. In November of 1953, he fell gravely ill, and died at the age of just 39 years old. In such a short time, he left an indelible legacy here in Swansea, which as we know is a city with more than 1,000 years of riveting history, having unfolded along the banks of the mighty River Tawe, which we find just here. At this point, close to its mouth, the river is spanned by the spectacular Sail Bridge, built in 2003 and providing a link between the city centre and the rest of Swansea docks. On the other side of the bridge, you'll find yet more historic docks, many still active as part of the modern port. But unusually, here on the river itself, you'll find yet more yachts, moored as part of Swansea's huge marina. The flow of this major river has been tamed in recent years. In the 1990s, the Swansea Barrage was built at the mouth of the river to serve as a hydroelectric turbine, but also to create a kind of lake at this point, creating yet more space for boat parking in this desirable coastal location. Indeed, having impressively regenerated its waterfront here in the years since its post-war industrial slump, Swansea is an attractive prospect for anyone visiting, whether by sea or by foot, as we've done today. It may not be quite as huge as Cardiff further down the coast, but located in a prime position within touching distance of plenty of South Wales's biggest towns, and with an array of gorgeous coastal scenery, complemented by a city centre filled to the brim with heritage, there's a whole lot more to Swansea than first meets the eye. And so it's here on the mighty sail bridge that our walk around Swansea has sadly come to its end. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to visiting Swansea for yourself sometime soon.